He was mine. The boy I'd been watching grow up 3 doors down for the past 5 years was my son, my Daniel. The child I'd mourned for 25 years, the baby whose empty crib had nearly destroyed me, the loss that had carved a permanent hollow in my chest. He'd been right there, living on Maple Street in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, the whole time. I'm Dorothy Walsh. Though most folks around here call me Dot, and I'm 67 years old now, I never imagined I'd be saying these words, never dreamed this story would be mine to tell. But here I am, sitting in the sunroom of my small rental house, looking out at the empty lot where the Henderson house used to stand, and I need you to hear what happened. Because what I'm about to share isn't just my story. It's a story about instinct, about the invisible thread that connects a mother to her child no matter how much time passes, no matter what lies have been constructed to keep them apart. I need to take you back to understand how I got here, to this moment of impossible truth. My life hasn't been extraordinary by any measure. I've been a working-class woman my entire life, spent 30 years as a nurse's aide at Willow Creek Memorial Hospital before my knees gave out and forced me into early retirement. I married my husband Robert when I was 23, and we had what I thought was a good, simple life together. We weren't rich, never would be, but we had each other, and we had dreams of a family. Those dreams came true in January 1999 when I gave birth to Daniel Robert Walsh. 6 pounds, 3 ounces of pure perfection. I can still remember every detail of his face, the way his tiny fingers would curl around mine, the soft, downy hair on his head that was just starting to come in auburn like my own. For 6 months, I lived in a state of exhausted bliss that only new mothers understand. Robert was working double shifts at the lumber yard, and I was on maternity leave, and our tiny apartment was filled with baby sounds and that distinct smell of formula and powder and new life. And then, on a Tuesday morning in July, Daniel was gone. Before I tell you about the Hendersons and Marcus and the 5 years that led to this revelation, before I share how a routine act of neighborly kindness unraveled into the most significant discovery of my life, you need to understand something. This channel is growing because of people like you, people who click on these stories and give them a chance. If you're sitting there right now, drawn in by this beginning, wondering how a mother could not recognize her own child for 5 years, I'm asking you to take just 2 seconds, literally 2 seconds, to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. These stories are completely free, and I pour everything into making sure they're told with the respect and detail they deserve. We're building something here, a community of people who believe in second chances and justice and the power of truth. Every single subscription helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like mine, stories that prove it's never too late for the truth to surface. And while you're down there, tap that like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells YouTube's algorithm that this story matters, that it should be shown to more people. Drop a comment too. Tell me what city or country you're watching from. Share what you think so far. We're building this together, and your support literally makes the difference between this story reaching hundreds or thousands of people. Thank you for being here. Now let me tell you how this all began. I was born Dorothy Ann Carpenter in 1957 in the small town of Millbrook, about 40 miles south of Willow Creek. My father worked at the steel mill until it closed in 1982, and my mother was a seamstress who took in work from home. I was the middle child of 5, wedged between 2 older brothers and 2 younger sisters, and I learned early how to make myself useful, how to stretch a dollar, how to find joy in simple things like library books and the community pool in summer. Willow Creek became my home when I was 22, fresh out of a 1-year nursing assistant program at the community college. The Memorial Hospital was hiring, and Robert Walsh, tall, quiet Robert with his steady hands and steadier heart, was the ambulance driver who brought patients to the emergency room where I worked. He'd always find a reason to linger for an extra minute, asking me questions about my day, bringing me coffee from the machine down the hall during my break. We married in the spring of 1980 in a small ceremony at St. Catherine's Church, and we moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of town, the side where the houses were smaller and the yards weren't quite as manicured, but where people looked out for each other. For 19 years, we tried to have a baby. 19 years of disappointment, of hope that turned to heartbreak month after month, of doctors who couldn't quite explain why conception wasn't happening, of treatments we couldn't quite afford. By the time I was 41, I'd resigned myself to the idea that parenthood wasn't going to be part of our story. Robert never said much about it. That was his way. But I could see the sadness in his eyes every time one of his co-workers brought their kids by the lumber yard. Every Christmas, when we'd buy gifts for our nieces and nephews, and then go home to our quiet apartment. And then, impossibly, miraculously, I got pregnant at 41. The doctor called it a spontaneous conception, said sometimes these things just happen when you stop trying so hard. I called it a gift from God. The pregnancy was difficult. I had gestational diabetes, my blood pressure was a constant concern, I was on modified bed rest for the last 2 months, but none of that mattered when they placed Daniel in my arms on that January morning. After nearly 2 decades of waiting, of aching for this exact moment, I was holding my son. Those first 6 months were the happiest of my life. Yes, I was exhausted. Caring for an infant at 42 is no joke, especially after waiting so long. But every sleepless night, every feeding, every diaper change felt like a privilege. Robert took on extra shifts to make up for my unpaid leave, and I poured every ounce of energy I had into caring for our miracle baby. Daniel was healthy, hit all his milestones, had the most infectious laugh that would bubble up from his belly when you played peekaboo. I documented everything in a baby book. His first smile, the first time he rolled over, his favorite songs, the way he'd grab at my hair during feedings. July 20th, 1999. Started like any other Tuesday. Daniel had a routine checkup scheduled at the pediatric clinic at Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where I'd worked for nearly 20 years. I knew most of the staff there, trusted them completely. The appointment was at 10 in the morning, just a standard 6-month well baby visit, vaccines, measurements, basic exam. I remember I dressed Daniel in a light blue onesie with little ducks on it, and I'd brought his favorite pacifier, the one with the yellow handle that he'd gotten attached to. The appointment went fine. Dr. Morrison said Daniel was developing beautifully, right on track for everything. We were in and out within 45 minutes. I stopped by the hospital cafeteria on the way out to grab a sandwich. I hadn't eaten breakfast, and I was planning to feed Daniel and put him down for his nap when we got home. The cafeteria was busy, full of staff on their lunch breaks and visitors grabbing quick meals. I got my sandwich and a bottle of water and found a small table near the windows. Daniel was in his carrier, which I'd set on the table where I could see him. He'd fallen asleep in the car on the way to the appointment and was still sleeping soundly, his little chest rising and falling in that perfect rhythm that all mothers know. I ate my sandwich quickly, kept glancing at him to make sure he was okay, planning to head home within 15 minutes. I had to use the restroom. That's what it came down to. 6 months postpartum, my bladder control still wasn't what it used to be, and I needed to go. The bathrooms were right there, literally 15 feet from where I was sitting. I could see the cafeteria table from the bathroom entrance. I looked around. The cafeteria was full of hospital staff, people I knew, security officers walking through on their rounds. Daniel was sound asleep. I would be gone for maybe 2 minutes, 3 at most. I asked the woman at the table next to mine, a nurse I recognized from the 3rd floor, if she'd keep an eye on my baby while I ran to the restroom. She smiled and said of course, she had 3 of her own, she understood. I walked the 15 feet to the bathroom, used the facilities, washed my hands, and walked back out. The carrier was gone. The table was empty. The nurse who'd been sitting nearby was still there, engrossed in her phone, and when I asked her where my baby was, where Daniel had gone, she looked up confused. "Didn't your husband just come get him?" she asked. "Guy in a baseball cap. He took the carrier, said you'd asked him to bring it to the car." I didn't have a husband with me. Robert was at work, and I had never asked anyone to take my baby anywhere. The next hours were a blur of panic and confusion. of security footage that showed a figure in a hospital maintenance uniform and a baseball cap pulled low, face obscured, walking out the emergency exit with my baby's carrier. Police came, questions were asked, an Amber Alert was issued. The hospital was locked down, searched top to bottom. Every employee was questioned, but Daniel was gone, vanished into thin air, and the person who took him had known exactly how to avoid the cameras, exactly which doors had blind spots, exactly how to walk out of that hospital without being clearly identified. The investigation went on for months. Detective James Riley was assigned to our case. A soft-spoken man in his 50s who'd worked child abduction cases before. He was thorough, dedicated, but as the weeks turned into months with no leads, no ransom calls, no sightings, even he had to admit that the trail had gone cold. The theory was that it was an opportunistic abduction, someone who'd seen a mother leave her baby unattended and seized the moment. The hospital security footage showed the maintenance uniform had been stolen from a supply closet 3 days before. Whoever took Daniel had planned it, at least to some degree. My world collapsed. There's no other way to describe what happened to me in the months and years after Daniel was taken. I couldn't work, couldn't bear to set foot in that hospital where I'd lost him. We had to move out of our apartment because every corner reminded me of him. Every sound in the night made me think I heard him crying. Robert tried to be strong, tried to keep us together, but grief like that is a weight that crushes even the strongest bonds. We didn't blame each other. We both knew it wasn't anyone's fault, that I'd done what countless mothers do every day, taken 2 minutes for a bathroom break. But the loss lived between us like a third presence, silent and suffocating. We moved to a smaller place, then eventually to the house on Maple Street in 2005. After we'd both accepted that Daniel was likely gone forever, that we had to find some way to keep living. Robert went back to work. I took a job at a nursing home on the edge of town, where I didn't know anyone and no one knew my story. We went through the motions of life. We celebrated anniversaries and Christmases and birthdays, but it was all hollow, all performance. The case remained open, but Detective Riley retired in 2008, and the new detective assigned to it admitted there was simply nothing new to investigate, no leads to follow. The years passed. We grew older. Robert's health started failing around 2018. His heart, weakened by years of stress and grief, finally started giving out. He died in March 2020, just as the pandemic was beginning, and I was left alone in that house on Maple Street, surrounded by the ghost of the family we never got to be. I was 64 when Robert died, retired from the nursing home, living on a modest pension and Social Security. The house was paid off. Robert had insisted on that before he died, wanted to make sure I had security. My days were quiet, filled with routines, morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks around the neighborhood, evenings with library books and television. I stayed in touch with my siblings, saw my nieces and nephews when they visited, but I'd become someone who existed on the margins of other people's lives, the woman who'd lost her baby, the widow, the sad lady in the small house on Maple Street. I never forgot Daniel. How could I? Every July 20th, I'd visit the cemetery where we'd placed a memorial stone for him, even though there was no body to bury. Every January 8th, his birthday, I'd allow myself to imagine what he'd look like at different ages. 6, 12, 18, 21. I'd created versions of him in my mind, watched him grow up in my imagination since I couldn't watch him grow up in reality. And then, in the late spring of 2019, about a year before Robert died, a new family moved into the house 3 doors down from mine. It was a nice house, one of the bigger ones on our street, with a wide front porch and a well-maintained yard. I watched from my kitchen window as the moving truck arrived, as a couple in their 60s directed the movers, as they carried boxes and furniture inside. The woman had short gray hair and a brisk, efficient way of moving. The man was tall, balding, with glasses that caught the sunlight. They looked like any other retired couple settling into a quiet neighborhood. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that David and Margaret Henderson weren't just any couple. And the young man who came to visit them regularly, the one they introduced as their son Marcus, wasn't just any son. He was mine. The Hendersons seemed like ideal neighbors at first. Margaret, I learned early on, was a retired elementary school teacher from Ohio. David had been an accountant. They'd moved to Willow Creek to be closer to their son Marcus, who they said had just gotten a job at a tech company in Pittsburgh and was commuting from their place until he found his own apartment. It was a perfectly normal story, the kind you hear in small towns all the time, parents following their adult children, wanting to be nearby to help out, to be part of their lives. I met Margaret first, about 2 weeks after they'd moved in. I'd baked a batch of oatmeal raisin cookies. It's what you do in small towns, bring something to new neighbors. And I walked down to their house on a warm June afternoon. Margaret answered the door with a smile that seemed genuine enough, thanked me for the cookies, invited me in for coffee. Their house was still partially unpacked, boxes stacked in corners, but she'd made the kitchen homey, with curtains already up and a vase of fresh flowers on the table. We chatted for about half an hour that first time. She told me about their life in Cleveland, about David's retirement 3 years earlier, about how they'd always wanted to live somewhere quieter, somewhere with real seasons and community feel. I told her about Robert's recent passing, about my years working at the nursing home, about how Maple Street was a good street with good people. It was pleasant, surface level, the kind of getting-to-know-you conversation neighbors have. Nothing remarkable, nothing that set off any alarms. I met Marcus a few days later. I was working in my small front garden. I grew tomatoes and herbs, nothing fancy, but it gave me something to do, when a car pulled into the Henderson driveway. A young man got out, mid-20s I'd guess, with auburn hair that caught the late afternoon sun and a lean build that spoke of someone who was naturally slim rather than someone who worked at it. He waved at me as he headed toward the house, friendly but not overly so. "You must be the neighbor Mom mentioned," he called over. "I'm Marcus." "Dorothy," I called back. "Welcome to the neighborhood." He thanked me and went inside. I didn't think much of it. He was a nice-looking young man, polite, exactly the kind of son you'd expect David and Margaret to have. Over the next few weeks, I'd see him coming and going. He stayed with them during the week and went back to Pittsburgh on weekends. Something about his apartment there not being ready yet. Sometimes I'd see him mowing their lawn, or helping David carry groceries in from the car, or sitting on their porch with a laptop, working. The thing is, I didn't pay that much attention at first. I was still deep in my grief over Robert, still moving through life in that fog that comes with fresh widowhood. The Hendersons were just neighbors. Marcus was just their son. I was friendly but distant, the way I'd become with most people since losing Daniel. I'd learned to protect myself by not getting too close, by keeping relationships surface level and safe. It was Margaret who started to draw me in, slowly, carefully, over the course of that summer and fall. She'd stop by my house with extra vegetables from her garden, or she'd knock on my door to ask if I needed anything from the store when she was making a run. Small kindnesses, the kind neighbors do for each other. I appreciated it, appreciated having someone check on me, someone who didn't know my whole tragic story and didn't look at me with pity. By the time winter came, we'd fallen into a comfortable friendship. Margaret and I would have coffee together once or twice a week, sometimes at her place, sometimes at mine. David was friendly but quieter, the kind of man who preferred his woodworking shop in the garage to social interaction. Marcus was around less as winter set in. He'd finally found his own place in Pittsburgh, Margaret said, but he still came home most weekends to visit his parents. I remember the first time I really looked at Marcus, really studied his face instead of just giving him a polite wave. It was February 2020, just a few weeks before Robert died. Marcus had come home for the weekend, and he was outside helping David clear snow from their driveway. I was watching from my kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, and something about the way Marcus moved, the set of his shoulders, the way he brushed snow off the car with these efficient, practiced movements. Something made me keep watching. He had auburn hair. Not brown, not red, but that particular shade of auburn that's uncommon enough to be noticeable. The same shade my mother had. The same shade my hair had been before it went gray. His build was lean but not weak, about 5'10" or 5'11", with long fingers that I could see even from my window when he pulled off his gloves to adjust his scarf. His face, in profile, had a straight nose and a strong jaw, and there was something about it that tugged at a memory I couldn't quite place. I shook it off. Lots of people had auburn hair. Lots of young men were tall and lean. I was just being maudlin, seeing shadows and connections that weren't there because I was missing Robert, missing the son I'd lost, missing the life that had been stolen from me. I went back to my coffee and tried not to think about it. But the feeling persisted. Over the next weeks and months, as the pandemic descended and the world shut down and we all retreated into our homes, I found myself watching the Henderson house more than I should have. It wasn't intentional at first. My living room window faced their house, and when you're stuck at home with nothing to do, you notice your neighbors' patterns. I noticed when Marcus started staying with them full-time in late March when his Pittsburgh office went remote. I noticed that he went running every morning at 7, same route, same pace, same Nike running shoes. I noticed that he liked to sit on their porch in the evenings with a book, and that he'd wave if he saw me at my window, friendly but not overly familiar. I noticed, though I didn't let myself examine why I was noticing, that he had a scar on his left forearm. I saw it one day in May when he was in their yard, wearing a short-sleeved shirt, reaching up to trim a branch from their maple tree. It was about 2 inches long, faded but visible, running along the outside of his forearm, the kind of scar you get from stitches, from some childhood accident. Daniel had fallen when he was learning to crawl, had caught his arm on the corner of our coffee table, and needed 3 stitches. The scar would have been on his left forearm, about 2 inches long. I told myself I was being crazy. Thousands of people had scars on their arms. It meant nothing. But the thought was there now, planted in my brain, growing roots whether I wanted it to or not. The first real warning sign, the first one I couldn't rationalize away, came on a Thursday in late June 2020. The pandemic restrictions were starting to ease a bit, and Margaret had invited me over for coffee on their back porch, where we could sit outside and socially distance. I went, grateful for the human interaction, carrying a plate of cookies I'd baked that morning. We sat on their wicker furniture, sipping coffee, talking about nothing, the weather, the news, how strange everything had become. Marcus came out while we were sitting there. He'd been inside working, and he came out to grab something from the shed at the back of their yard. "Morning, Mrs. Walsh," he said with a smile. "Please call me Dorothy," I reminded him. We'd had this conversation before, but he still defaulted to the more formal address. "Morning, Dorothy," he corrected himself. He headed toward the shed, then stopped and turned back. "Hey, Mom mentioned you used to work at Memorial Hospital? My mother," he gestured at Margaret. "She's been having this issue with her shoulder, and we were trying to figure out which doctor to see. Do you have any recommendations?" It was a perfectly normal question, but as I started to answer, to tell him about the orthopedic practice I knew was good, Margaret interrupted. Her voice was just a touch too sharp, a touch too quick. "Marcus, honey, I told you we'd talk about that later. Don't bother Dorothy with medical questions." There was something in her tone, something I couldn't quite name. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, something passing between them, and then he shrugged. "Sure, Mom. Sorry, Dorothy." He went to the shed, got whatever he needed, and went back inside. I thought it was odd, but I didn't dwell on it. Not then. Margaret steered the conversation to other topics, and we finished our coffee, and I went home thinking nothing more about it than that Margaret was maybe a little overprotective of her son, a little too quick to manage his interactions with others. The second warning sign came in August. I was at the grocery store, the small one on Main Street, and I ran into Marcus in the produce section. We'd both reached for the same bag of apples, and we laughed about it, and we ended up talking while we both finished our shopping. He was easy to talk to, I'd noticed that before. He had this way of listening that made you feel heard, of asking follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely interested. We talked about books. He was reading a biography of Teddy Roosevelt. I was in the middle of a mystery novel, and about the strange limbo of pandemic life, and about how Willow Creek was growing on him, even though he'd initially planned to just stay with his parents temporarily. At one point, as we were walking toward the checkout lanes, he mentioned he was thinking about looking for a place of his own in Willow Creek instead of going back to Pittsburgh. "I turned 26 in January," he said. "Feels like it's time to stop living with my parents, you know?" 26 in January 2021, which meant he was born in January 1995. The same month and year Daniel had been born. The exact same month and year. My heart did something strange in my chest, a flutter that wasn't quite normal. I managed to keep my voice steady, managed to smile and say something about how it was smart to save money by staying with family, managed to finish the conversation and check out and drive home without letting on that something seismic had just shifted inside me. January 1995, the same as Daniel. It was a coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. Lots of people were born in January 1995. It didn't mean anything, but combined with the auburn hair, the scar, the lean build, the way Margaret had shut down that conversation about the hospital, combined with all of that, it was starting to feel like too many coincidences. I didn't know what to do with this information. I had no proof of anything. No real reason to believe that Marcus Henderson was anything other than exactly who he appeared to be. I was a 66-year-old widow with a history of trauma and loss, probably seeing patterns where there were none, trying to fill the void Daniel's absence had left. That's what the rational part of my brain told me. But there was another part, a quieter, but more insistent part, that whispered, "What if?" The third warning sign was a photograph. It happened in September, during one of those warm autumn afternoons that Pennsylvania does so well. Marcus was outside playing with their dog. They'd gotten a golden retriever puppy in August, a bouncing ball of energy named Riley. I was on my porch reading, and I could hear Marcus laughing as Riley chased a tennis ball around their yard. Could see the pure joy on his face as he bent down to ruffle the puppy's ears. Without really thinking about it, I pulled out my phone and took a picture. Just a casual shot, the kind you take when you see something nice. Young man, happy dog, beautiful day. I didn't think anything of it, posted it on my Facebook with a caption about enjoying autumn in Willow Creek. Within an hour, Margaret was at my door. She was polite about it, but there was steel underneath the politeness. "Dorothy, I saw your Facebook post. I wonder if you could take it down. Marcus is very private about social media, doesn't like having his photo online. He's had some issues in the past with online harassment, people from his college days, and we're just very careful about his image being out there." It was a reasonable request, the kind of thing that made sense in our modern age. I immediately apologized, took the post down, assured her it wouldn't happen again. She thanked me, gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and left. But something about the interaction felt off. It wasn't just concern for privacy. It was fear. I'd seen that look before, in my years working with patients, with families. It was the look of someone protecting a secret. The fourth warning sign came in October, and it was the one that really started to crack my rationalizations. I'd invited Margaret over for coffee, and she'd brought photo albums to show me pictures of Marcus growing up. She was proud of him, wanted to share his childhood with me. We sat at my kitchen table, going through the albums, and I made all the appropriate sounds. Oh, how cute. What a sweet little boy. Look at that smile. But as I looked at the photos, something was wrong. The pictures started when Marcus was about 5 or 6 years old. There were school photos, birthday parties, family vacations. But there were no baby pictures, no photos of Margaret pregnant, no hospital shots of a newborn. No first birthday cake smash, no crawling baby, no toddler learning to walk, nothing before age 5. I mentioned it, trying to keep my tone casual. No baby pictures? Margaret's hand stilled on the album page. For just a second, maybe 2, she froze. Then she laughed, but it sounded forced. Oh, you know how it is. We had a house fire when Marcus was 4. Lost most of our photos from his early years. Tragic, really. I wish I had those memories captured, but... She shrugged, turned the page, pointed to a picture of 6-year-old Marcus at what appeared to be a school play. A house fire. It was plausible. These things happened. But the timing, everything lost before age 4, everything preserved after, it felt too convenient, too neat. And the way she'd frozen before answering, the way her fingers had tightened on the album edge, that wasn't the reaction of someone casually mentioning an old tragedy. That was the reaction of someone delivering a prepared lie. The 5th warning sign was medical. It happened in November, when Marcus came down with a nasty flu. Margaret mentioned it to me in passing, said he was really sick, that they'd taken him to the urgent care clinic in town. I offered to help. I'd been a nurse's aide for decades, was comfortable with sick people. But Margaret declined quickly, almost too quickly. But then, a few days later, when she was updating me on how he was doing, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. The doctor said his immune system is probably a bit compromised because of his childhood illness, she said absently, stirring sugar into her coffee. He had some respiratory issues as a baby, was in the hospital for a bit. It's why we're always so careful with him during flu season. Respiratory issues as a baby. Daniel had been born with a small hole in his heart. A minor congenital defect that the doctor said would likely close on its own, but that we had to monitor carefully. It affected his breathing sometimes, made him more susceptible to respiratory infections. The doctors had said it was something that could have long-term implications for his immune system, even after the hole closed. The chances of Marcus having the exact same issue, the same respiratory problems, the same immune system concerns, it was too specific, too particular. This wasn't just auburn hair or a birth month. This was a medical condition that matched Daniel's exactly. I didn't say anything to Margaret. I couldn't. I didn't know what to say, how to even frame the question that was screaming in my head. But after she left, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at my hands and felt something inside me shift from, maybe I'm imagining things, to, something is very wrong here. The 6th warning sign was about Marcus himself, something he said to me in December. We'd run into each other at the hardware store. He was picking up snow shovels. I was getting salt for my walkway, and we ended up talking in the parking lot for a few minutes. The conversation turned to the holidays, and he mentioned that Christmas always felt a little strange for him. I don't have a lot of early childhood memories, he said, squinting into the weak winter sunlight. Like, nothing before age 5 or 6. Mom says it's because of the fire, because the trauma kind of blocked things out. But it's weird, you know, to have this chunk of your life that's just gone. Missing memories, unexplained gaps, the story about a fire. I stood there in that cold parking lot and realized with absolute clarity that Marcus himself didn't know. He believed he was Marcus Henderson, born to David and Margaret, raised in Ohio. He had no idea that there might be another story, another truth. And if he didn't know, if he genuinely believed the narrative his parents had constructed, that made David and Margaret not just people who'd moved in down the street, but people who'd been actively hiding something for over 2 decades. People who'd taken extraordinary measures to erase a past and create a new identity. People who'd done exactly what kidnappers would do if they'd stolen a baby and wanted to raise him as their own. The 7th warning sign came on New Year's Eve, just a few weeks before Marcus's birthday. Margaret had invited me to their small celebration, just the 3 of them, plus me, quiet and safe during pandemic times. I almost didn't go. By this point, I was struggling with what I suspected, with what I thought might be true but couldn't prove. Being around them felt like walking on a knife's edge, trying to act normal while my brain screamed with questions. But I went, and at one point during the evening, I was in their kitchen helping Margaret with dishes when I noticed a baby blanket draped over a chair. It was pale blue with white stars, soft flannel, clearly old and well-loved. Something about it caught my eye, made me look closer. In one corner, partially faded but still visible, were initials embroidered in white thread. DRW, Daniel Robert Walsh, my son's initials. The blanket his grandmother had made for him, the one that had been in his carrier when he was taken from the hospital cafeteria. I'd described it to police so many times I could see it in my sleep. Pale blue, white stars, embroidered initials. This wasn't similar. This was identical. This was Daniel's blanket. I must have made some sound, some small gasp, because Margaret turned from the sink and followed my gaze. Her face went pale. "Oh, that old thing," she said, her voice artificially light. "I keep meaning to throw it out. Marcus had it as a child, attached to it like you wouldn't believe, but it's ancient now." She walked over, picked it up, and I saw her deliberately fold it so the initials were hidden. "I'll just put this away." She left the kitchen, and I heard her footsteps going up the stairs. When she came back down 2 minutes later, the blanket was gone. And she didn't mention it again. That night, I barely slept. The blanket had been the proof I'd needed, the concrete physical evidence that connected Marcus to Daniel. But what could I do with this knowledge? I had no proof. I hadn't taken a photo. It would be my word against hers, and she could simply deny the initials had been there at all. Could say I'd been mistaken. Could suggest that grief and age were making me see things that weren't real. The 8th and final warning sign was the one that set everything in motion, that pushed me from suspicion to action. It was mid-January 2021, just after Marcus's 26th birthday. I'd been invited to his small birthday dinner, had watched him blow out candles on a homemade cake, had sung Happy Birthday with David and Margaret. The whole time, I'd been thinking about Daniel, about how he would have been 26 years old, about how I should have been the one baking his cake and singing to him. A few days after the party, I was over at their house for coffee. I'd kept up the appearance of friendship even though it was killing me, and Marcus was showing me something on his laptop, some article about environmental conservation he thought I'd find interesting. As he scrolled, a notification popped up from some genealogy website. "Oh, forgot I had that open," he said with a laugh. "I've been trying to do our family tree, but I keep hitting dead ends. Mom says it's because a lot of the records were destroyed in that fire, but I thought I'd at least be able to find some birth records, you know?" He clicked away from the notification, but I'd seen it. A genealogy search. Him trying to find records that Margaret claimed didn't exist. Him trying to trace a family tree that I was suddenly certain was built on lies. "Have you tried DNA testing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Those ancestry DNA kits? My niece did one and found all kinds of relatives she didn't know about." Margaret's coffee cup hit the table just a fraction too hard. "Marcus isn't interested in those," she said firmly. "Are you, honey? We've talked about this. Those tests aren't reliable, and they sell your genetic information." Marcus shrugged. "I guess not, though it might be interesting." "It wouldn't tell you anything you don't already know," Margaret said, and there was finality in her voice. "We're your family. That's what matters." The way she'd shut that down, the way she'd made sure Marcus wouldn't pursue DNA testing, it was the last piece I needed. Everything clicked into place. The auburn hair, the birth month and year, the scar, the medical condition, the missing baby photos, the blanket with Daniel's initials, Marcus's memory gaps, the Hendersons' overprotective behavior and their fear of anyone getting too close, of anyone asking too many questions. They'd taken my son. I didn't know how they'd done it, didn't know if one of them had been the person in the maintenance uniform on that hospital security tape, didn't know what their original plan had been. But I knew with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from maternal instinct and 25 years of grief that Marcus Henderson was Daniel Walsh. And then, in late January, everything accelerated. I came home from the grocery store one afternoon to find the Henderson house dark and a for sale sign already planted in their front yard. I knocked on their door. No answer. I tried calling Margaret's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. I walked around to the back of the house and peered through the windows. the house was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of furniture, of belongings, of any sign that anyone had lived there. They'd vanished, just like that. Overnight, without warning, without saying goodbye. The friendly neighbors who'd lived 3 doors down for nearly 2 years had packed up and disappeared, taking Marcus, taking Daniel with them. That's when I stopped wondering and started acting. That's when everything changed. Are you feeling what I felt in that moment? That mixture of rage and grief and determination? If you are, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button. It's right there below the video. Takes 1 second. Because this next part of the story, this is where everything shifts. This is where a 67-year-old widow who'd spent 25 years mourning her son decided she wasn't going to be a victim anymore. And your like tells YouTube that this story matters, that it should reach more people, that stories like mine, stories about never giving up, about fighting for truth, these are the stories that need to be told. Drop a comment too. Tell me what you think so far. Tell me what you would do in my situation. Are you thinking I was crazy? Are you thinking I should have acted sooner? Tell me. And while you're there, tell me what city or country you're watching from. We're building a community here, and your engagement helps this channel grow and reach more people with stories that prove it's never too late for justice. Now, let me tell you about the moment I decided to stop being afraid and start being a detective. The day after I discovered the Hendersons had vanished, I stood in my kitchen and made myself think clearly for the first time in months. I'd spent so much time doubting myself, questioning whether I was seeing connections that weren't really there, wondering if grief and loneliness had made me delusional. But the Hendersons' sudden disappearance had confirmed everything. Innocent people don't flee in the night. Innocent people don't abandon a house and leave a for sale sign without telling their closest neighbor goodbye. People only run like that when they're afraid of being discovered. I needed help, but I didn't know where to start. The original investigation into Daniel's disappearance had gone cold decades ago. Detective Riley was retired, living in Florida now, according to what I'd heard through the grapevine. The Willow Creek Police Department was small, and I had no evidence beyond a series of coincidences and a baby blanket I'd seen once and couldn't prove existed. If I went to them with my suspicions, they'd probably be kind, but ultimately dismissive. The grieving mother who couldn't let go, who saw her lost child in every young man with auburn hair. So I started with what I could do myself. I went home and pulled out every document I'd saved from Daniel's case. I still had the police reports from 1999, the hospital security footage stills, the physical description we'd given to investigators. I had photos of Daniel from the first 6 months of his life. My baby book was still in a box in my closet, one of the few things I'd kept close all these years because looking at it hurt too much, but throwing it away hurt worse. I spread everything out on my dining room table and really looked at it for the first time in years. Baby Daniel with his shock of auburn hair that was just coming in. Baby Daniel's left arm, visible in a photo taken just days before the kidnapping, with the fresh scar from his stitches. The medical records noting his heart condition, his respiratory issues. And then I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the few photos I had of Marcus, the ones I'd taken before Margaret had asked me to delete the Facebook post. The ones I'd forgotten were still saved in my phone. I put Daniel's baby photos next to Marcus's photos. I was looking for features that would remain consistent, bone structure and ear shape, and the spacing of eyes, the things that don't change much between infancy and adulthood. And there it was. The exact same slope to the nose, the exact same set of the ears, just slightly protruding on the left side. The exact same spacing between the eyes, that particular width that's determined by skull structure, and doesn't change. I needed more. I needed something that would convince not just me, but authorities, something that would hold up as evidence. I pulled out my laptop. I wasn't great with technology, but I could manage basic internet searches, and I started researching the Hendersons. I knew they'd claimed to be from Cleveland, that David had been an accountant and Margaret a teacher. I started with the obvious: social media, public records, anything I could find online. What I discovered was chilling in its thoroughness. David and Margaret Henderson existed, according to public records. They had a house in Cleveland from 2003 to 2019. They had work histories that checked out, at least on the surface. But when I dug deeper, when I started looking for records that would have predated Marcus's existence, things got murky. Margaret's teaching license had been issued in 2003, the year they'd apparently moved to Cleveland. Before that? Nothing. David's accounting certification? Also 2003. Their marriage license? 2003. It was as if David and Margaret Henderson had simply come into existence in 2003 with a 4-year-old child and complete backstories, but no documented past. Every piece of their identity, their entire lives, seemed to start the year that Marcus would have been 4 years old. The exact age when children start forming permanent memories, when you can't hide their past from them anymore by simply moving and creating new identities. I sat back from my laptop, my heart pounding. This wasn't just suspicious. This was proof of identity fabrication. People don't just materialize with complete work histories and marriage licenses unless they've created new identities, unless they're running from something or hiding something catastrophic. I knew I needed professional help, someone who knew how to navigate this kind of investigation. I spent 2 days researching private investigators in Pennsylvania, reading reviews, trying to determine who might take on a cold case from a senior citizen with limited funds. I finally settled on a woman named Patricia Chen, who worked out of Harrisburg. Her website mentioned experience with missing persons cases, with cold cases, with family searches. She was expensive. Her hourly rate made me wince, but I had some savings. The money Robert and I had put aside over the years that I'd been living off since retirement. I called her on a Wednesday morning in early February. I explained the situation as clearly and calmly as I could. The kidnapping in 1999, the neighbors who'd moved in and then disappeared, the coincidences that had accumulated until they weren't coincidences anymore. I expected skepticism. What I got was careful attention. "Mrs. Walsh," Patricia said after I'd finished, "I'm not going to lie to you. This is a long shot. But there are enough red flags in what you're telling me that I think it's worth investigating. The Hendersons' sudden disappearance alone is significant. If they'd been legitimate, they wouldn't have run. And this business about their identities only going back to 2003, that's not normal. Send me everything you have and let me do some digging." Over the next month, Patricia worked while I waited and worried and tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. She had resources I didn't, databases she could access, connections with law enforcement and court systems. She found things I couldn't have found on my own. She discovered that the house fire in Ohio that Margaret had mentioned, the one that supposedly destroyed all of Marcus's baby photos, had never happened. There was no fire on record at any address associated with the Hendersons in Ohio in 1999 or the years surrounding it. The story was a complete fabrication. She found more concerning things. The hospital where Margaret claimed Marcus had been born? No birth record on file. The school where he'd supposedly attended kindergarten? They had records of a Marcus Henderson starting first grade in 2002, but nothing before that. His Social Security number had been issued in 2003 when he was already 8 years old, which was unusual but not impossible if someone was adopting a child or bringing a child into the country. But there was no adoption record, no international birth certificate, no documentation of where Marcus Henderson had existed before age 4. "Dorothy," Patricia said during one of our phone calls in mid-March, "I think you're right. I think Marcus is your son. The Hendersons created identities for themselves and for him, and they've been living under those identities for 18 years. But proving it is going to require DNA, and we need to figure out where they've gone." Finding them turned out to be easier than I'd expected. Patricia had put alerts on the email addresses associated with the Hendersons, tracking any online activity. In late March, David Henderson registered for an email newsletter from a hardware store in Burlington, Vermont. It wasn't proof they'd moved there, but it was a lead. Patricia dug deeper and found a rental agreement in Burlington for a David and Margaret Henderson, signed in February 2021. They'd run north, probably figured that Vermont was far enough from Pennsylvania, different enough, that they'd be safe. "Now comes the hard part," Patricia said. "We need to convince law enforcement to take action, and for that, we need DNA evidence that proves Marcus is Daniel. Are you ready for what comes next?" I was ready. I'd been ready for 25 years, but readiness didn't make it any less terrifying. Patricia contacted the Willow Creek Police Department with her findings, laid out the evidence she'd compiled, requested that they reopen Daniel's case. To my surprise, they listened. Maybe it was because Patricia was a licensed investigator with credibility. Maybe it was because the evidence she'd presented was more substantial than they'd had in years. Maybe it was because a new chief of police had taken over and wanted to make his mark by solving a decades-old cold case. Whatever the reason, they agreed to investigate further. They contacted the Vermont State Police, explained the situation, requested assistance in locating and interviewing the Hendersons. Vermont took it seriously. Child abduction cases don't expire, and if there was even a chance that Marcus Henderson was a kidnapped child, they were obligated to investigate. But they needed probable cause to compel a DNA test, needed something more concrete than circumstantial evidence and an old woman's certainty. That's where I came in. Detective Sarah Morrison from Willow Creek, no relation to the pediatrician who'd seen baby Daniel on the day he was taken, reached out to me directly. She was in her 40s, professional but warm, and she treated my story with respect instead of skepticism. We met at the police station, and she walked me through everything I'd observed about Marcus, everything I'd noticed about the Hendersons, every detail I could remember. "The blanket with the initials is key," she said, taking notes. "If we can establish that the blanket in their possession matches the description of the one taken with Daniel, that's physical evidence. Do you have any photos of the original blanket?" I did. In my baby book, there was a photo of Daniel at 2 months old, wrapped in that pale blue blanket, the embroidered initials visible in the corner. I'd taken that photo myself, had carefully documented his early months. Detective Morrison made copies, added them to the case file. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "Vermont is going to approach the Hendersons for a welfare check on Marcus. They'll use the pretext of following up on a cold case, see how they react. If the Hendersons lawyer up immediately and refuse to cooperate, that tells us something. If Marcus is willing to talk, if he has questions about his own past, that tells us something else. And if we can find probable cause, we can request a court order for DNA testing." The welfare check happened on a Tuesday morning in mid-April. Vermont State Police showed up at the Hendersons' rental house in Burlington, asked to speak with Marcus, told him there were questions about an old case they were trying to resolve. According to the report I saw later, Marcus had been confused but cooperative. He had no idea why police were asking him about his childhood, about any memories he had from before age 5, about whether he'd ever lived in Pennsylvania as a baby. The Hendersons, predictably, had not been cooperative. They demanded to know what this was about, why police were harassing their family, threatened to call a lawyer. Their reaction had been exactly what guilty people do when confronted: panic, aggression, and immediate refusal to answer questions. But Marcus had been different. According to Detective Morrison, who'd spoken with the Vermont investigators, Marcus had seemed genuinely puzzled by his parents' reaction. He'd asked them why they were so upset, what the big deal was, why they wouldn't just answer the officers' questions. And when his mother had told him sharply to be quiet, to not say another word, something had shifted in his expression. Doubt. The first crack in the foundation of trust. The Vermont police hadn't been able to compel DNA testing based solely on that initial contact, but they'd planted seeds. They'd given Marcus a card, told him that if he had questions about his past, about his identity, he could reach out to them directly. They'd made it clear that his cooperation was voluntary, but that there were serious questions that needed answering. What happened next was something none of us had anticipated. 3 days after the welfare check, Marcus called the Vermont State Police on his own. He'd done his own research, had started looking into the questions they'd raised, and he'd found things that didn't add up. He'd found the holes in his parents' stories, the gaps in documentation, the absence of any evidence of his existence before age 4, and he'd found, through a Google search that combined Daniel Walsh, Pennsylvania, and 1999, the news articles about my baby's kidnapping. When Detective Morrison called to tell me that Marcus had voluntarily agreed to DNA testing, I sat down hard in my kitchen chair and cried for the first time in months. Not tears of sadness, though there was some of that, but tears of relief and hope and the overwhelming realization that this might actually be happening, that I might actually be about to get my son back. The DNA test was processed on an expedited basis given the circumstances. Marcus gave a cheek swab sample. I drove to the Willow Creek police station and gave my own sample. They sent both to the state lab with a request for priority processing. Detective Morrison warned me it would still take a few weeks, told me not to get my hopes up too high, reminded me that there was still a chance this would all turn out to be an elaborate coincidence. But I knew. In the way that mothers know things, in that bone-deep certainty that transcends logic and evidence, I knew that Marcus Henderson was my Daniel. The results came back on May 7th, 2021. I was in my living room, trying to read a book and failing completely because I couldn't focus on anything except my phone, waiting for it to ring. When it finally did, when Detective Morrison's number appeared on my screen, my hand was shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. "Dorothy," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice, could hear the emotion she was trying to keep professional. "The DNA is a match. Marcus Henderson is Daniel Walsh. He's your son." I don't remember what I said in response. I don't remember if I said anything coherent at all. I remember the sound that came out of me, something between a sob and a laugh, pure release of 25 years of grief and hope and desperate yearning. I remember sliding off my chair onto my kitchen floor, phone pressed to my ear, Detective Morrison's voice saying gentle things I couldn't quite process. My son was alive. My Daniel was alive. He'd been 3 doors down from me for 2 years, had drunk coffee in my kitchen and mowed his parents' lawn, and talked to me about books and the weather and everything except the truth we'd both been living without knowing it. He was alive. And now came the question of what to do next. The legal machinery of justice moves slowly, even in cases as clear-cut as this one turned out to be. Once the DNA results confirmed that Marcus Henderson was Daniel Robert Walsh, a series of events cascaded into motion, each one necessary, but each one feeling like it took an eternity. First came the arrest of David and Margaret Henderson. Vermont State Police, working in coordination with Willow Creek authorities and the FBI, because child kidnapping across state lines is a federal crime, descended on the Hendersons' Burlington rental house on the morning of May 10th, 3 days after the DNA confirmation. I wasn't there, but Detective Morrison described it to me later. David had answered the door, and his face had gone white when he saw the officers. Margaret had tried to run, had actually made it to their back door before an officer stopped her. They'd both been taken into custody without incident, charged with kidnapping, conspiracy, identity fraud, and a list of other crimes that would eventually grow longer as investigators dug deeper into exactly how they'd orchestrated this. Marcus, and I still thought of him as Marcus, because that's who he believed he was. That's the identity he'd lived with for 25 years, had been at work when his parents were arrested. The Vermont police had waited until he was gone to make the arrest, wanting to minimize his trauma, wanting to give him space to process everything that was happening. When he came home from work that evening to find police cars in the driveway and his parents gone, he'd called the detective whose card he'd been given. They'd explained what had happened, gently but clearly, and they'd offered him support services, a counselor, assistance in navigating what was about to become a media circus. Because, of course, it became a media circus. Baby stolen from hospital. 25 years ago, found living 3 doors from mother, was the kind of headline that news organizations dream of. By May 12th, my house was surrounded by reporters. News vans lined Maple Street. My phone rang constantly with requests for interviews. The story spread from local news to regional to national, picked up by major networks, trending on social media, discussed on morning talk shows. The whole country, it seemed, wanted to know how this had happened, how a mother and son had lived in such proximity without knowing, how the Hendersons had maintained this deception for so long. I gave one interview to a local reporter I'd known casually for years, and then I stopped answering calls. What I needed wasn't public attention. It was time to prepare myself for what came next. Because Detective Morrison had explained that while Marcus was legally my son, while the DNA proved biological relationship, he was also a 26-year-old man who'd been raised by other people, who had no memory of me, who'd built an entire identity around being Marcus Henderson. Reuniting with him wasn't going to be like the movies, where we'd run into each other's arms and everything would be instantly perfect. "He's agreed to meet you," Detective Morrison told me during a phone call in mid-May. "But Dorothy, I need you to understand, he's traumatized right now. His entire life has been revealed as a lie. The people he thought were his parents are in jail. He's questioning every memory, every belief he has about himself. He's agreed to meet you because he wants answers, wants to understand who he is and where he came from. But this is going to be complicated." I understood that. Of course I did. I'd had 25 years to grieve and wonder and imagine what it would be like if I ever saw my son again. He'd had 2 weeks to process the fact that his entire existence was built on a kidnapping, that the parents who'd raised him were actually criminals, that he had a whole other identity he'd been stolen from. We were in completely different places emotionally, and I needed to meet him where he was, not where I wanted him to be. The meeting was arranged for May 24th at a family counseling center in Burlington. Neutral territory, with a mediator present, designed to make Marcus feel safe and supported. I drove up the day before, stayed in a small hotel near the center, barely slept that night as I mentally prepared for what was about to happen. What do you say to the child you lost? How do you explain 25 years of absence? How do you look at a man who has your eyes, your hair, your genetic code, and tell him you're his mother when he has no memory of you at all? The counseling center was a small brick building with a calm, peaceful atmosphere designed to put people at ease. I arrived 15 minutes early, sat in the parking lot trying to steady my breathing, trying to calm my racing heart. I was 67 years old. My son was 26. We were meeting as strangers who happened to share DNA. Detective Morrison met me in the parking lot, walked in with me for moral support. The receptionist led us to a comfortable room with soft couches and warm lighting, more like a living room than an office. The mediator, Dr. Rachel Kim, was already there. She was in her 50s, kind-faced, with a gentle demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She explained how the meeting would go, assured me that I could take breaks if I needed them, reminded me that Marcus might need breaks too, that this was a process and we shouldn't expect to resolve everything in one session. And then Marcus arrived. I heard the door open behind me, heard footsteps, and I turned around and saw my son for the first time, knowing he was my son. He stood in the doorway looking uncertain, nervous, younger than his 26 years. He was wearing jeans and a blue button-down shirt, his auburn hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it, which I later learned was exactly what he did when he was anxious. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "Hi," he finally said, his voice quiet. I guess I'm Daniel? Or Marcus. I don't really know anymore." "You're whoever you want to be," I heard myself say. My own voice thick with emotion I was trying to keep controlled. "Names don't define us. You're my son. That's all that matters to me." "Doctor." Kim guided us to sit down, Marcus on one couch, me on the other, with her between us like a buffer. She explained that this first meeting was just to begin the process of connection, to start asking and answering questions, to begin building what would hopefully become a relationship. Marcus spoke first. "I need to know what happened. The police told me some of it, but I need to hear it from you. I need to understand who I was before. before I became Marcus. So I told him. I told him about the pregnancy I'd thought would never happen, about the joy of his birth, about the 6 months I'd had with him that were the happiest of my life. I told him about the hospital cafeteria, about the 2 minutes I'd stepped away, about coming back to find him gone. I told him about the investigation that led nowhere, about the years of searching, about how his father, his biological father, Robert, had died 3 years ago, never knowing that Daniel was alive. I told him about the grief that had carved a permanent place in my life, about how I'd learned to live with the loss, but never to accept it, never to stop hoping that somehow, somewhere, he was alive and okay. I showed him photos. The baby book I'd brought with me, filled with pictures of his first 6 months, him at 1 week old, sleeping in his bassinet, him at 3 months, laughing at something off camera, him at 6 months, the last photo taken the morning of the day he was taken, sitting in his car seat ready to go to the doctor, him in the blue blanket with the embroidered initials, the blanket I'd seen in the Henderson house that had been the final confirmation of what I'd suspected. Marcus looked at the photos with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I don't remember any of this," he said softly. "That's me. I can see the resemblance, but it's like looking at a stranger. I don't have any connection to that baby." "I know," I said, "and that's okay. You can't force memories that aren't there. But maybe we can make new ones." We talked for 2 hours that first meeting. Marcus asked questions. What had I done for work? Was I married? Did I have other children? What was Willow Creek like? Why had we moved to that particular house on Maple Street? I answered everything honestly. I told him I'd never remarried after Robert died, that Daniel had been my only child, that I'd chosen that house simply because it was affordable and in a quiet neighborhood, and I'd needed somewhere peaceful to live out my retirement. He told me about his life as Marcus, growing up in what he'd thought was Ohio but was actually, investigators had now determined, various places in the Midwest and East Coast as the Hendersons moved around to stay ahead of any potential discovery. The gaps in his memory that had always troubled him, the feeling he'd had sometimes that something was wrong, that pieces didn't fit, but he'd never been able to articulate what exactly felt off. The relationships he'd had, the job he'd worked, the life he'd built, all of it real even if the foundation it was built on turned out to be false. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said at one point, his voice breaking. "Marcus Henderson was a lie, but I don't know how to be Daniel Walsh. That person is a stranger to me." "Then maybe you don't have to be either one completely," I suggested carefully. "Maybe you can be a new person, someone who incorporates both parts of your story. Maybe that's okay." Dr. Kim helped guide us through the more difficult emotional territory. She explained that Marcus would likely go through something similar to grief as he processed losing the identity he'd known, that he'd need time and therapy and patience from everyone involved, that rebuilding a relationship between us would take months, if not years, and that we couldn't force it to happen faster than it naturally would. When the session ended, Marcus stood up to leave, and I stood too. We faced each other across the room, and I wanted so badly to hug him, to hold my son for the first time in 25 years. But I didn't. I could see in his body language that he wasn't ready for physical contact, that he needed space and time to come to terms with everything. "Can we do this again?" he asked. "Meet again, I mean. I have more questions." "Anytime you want," I said. "I've waited 25 years. I can wait as long as you need." He nodded, gave me a small, tentative smile, and left. I sat back down on the couch and let myself cry, Dr. Kim sitting beside me offering tissues and quiet support. I'd found my son. He was alive, healthy, grown into a good man despite the circumstances of his upbringing. But he wasn't really mine, not in any meaningful way, not yet. The woman who'd raised him had stolen him from me, had erased his past, had built an entire life on a foundation of lies. But she'd also, apparently, loved him and cared for him, and given him a stable enough childhood that he'd grown into a kind, thoughtful adult. The justice system would deal with the Hendersons. What I needed to focus on was building something with Daniel, with Marcus, with my son, whoever he decided he wanted to be. While I was beginning the slow process of building a relationship with my son, the legal case against David and Margaret Henderson was moving forward with surprising speed. Federal kidnapping charges are taken seriously, especially in cases this clear-cut, and the prosecutors were determined to see it through. The investigation into the Hendersons revealed a story that was both meticulously planned and horrifyingly opportunistic. Margaret Henderson, whose real name investigators discovered was actually Margaret Sutton, had been a patient at Willow Creek Memorial Hospital in July 1999. She'd suffered a miscarriage, her fourth, at 5 months pregnant. She was 41 years old, and the doctors had told her this would be her last chance, that her body couldn't handle another pregnancy, that she needed to accept she wasn't going to have biological children. She'd been devastated. Her husband David, whose real name was David Sutton, had been with her during the loss, had seen her fall into a deep depression in the days after. They'd talked about adoption. But Margaret had become fixated on the idea of having an infant, of starting from the beginning, of not missing any of those crucial early moments. She'd wanted a baby, and she'd wanted one immediately, and the adoption process with its background checks and waiting periods and home studies had felt like another form of torture. She'd been in that hospital cafeteria the same day I was. She'd seen me leave Daniel in his carrier while I went to the bathroom. She'd heard me ask the nurse at the next table to watch him. And in a moment of impulse or madness or desperate longing, she'd seen her opportunity. She'd still had her hospital bracelet on from her own recent stay. She'd known the hospital layout, knew where the cameras were and weren't. She'd walked over to my table while the nurse was distracted with her phone, had picked up Daniel's carrier, had walked out through the emergency exit she knew wasn't monitored, had put him in her car and driven away. David hadn't known. Not at first. According to his testimony, which he gave in exchange for a reduced sentence, Margaret had come home with a baby and told him she'd been approached by a desperate young woman who couldn't care for her child, who'd asked Margaret to take him, who'd signed informal adoption papers. David had believed it at first. It sounded plausible, and he'd wanted to believe it because he'd wanted to save his wife from her depression, wanted to make her happy. By the time he'd started to suspect the truth, they'd had the baby for months, Margaret was bonded to him, and David made the choice to protect his wife rather than do the right thing. They'd moved immediately, left Ohio and driven south, eventually settling in Georgia under their real names, since there was no reason yet to change them. I didn't know who they were, hadn't seen them, couldn't identify them. They'd kept Daniel, whom they'd renamed Marcus, isolated for his first few years, homeschooled him, didn't get him proper medical care or documentation. When he was 4, when it became clear they couldn't continue hiding completely, they'd moved to Cleveland and created new identities for themselves as David and Margaret Henderson. They'd gotten fake documents for Marcus, showing he'd been born in 1995 in a home birth, had retroactively created a paper trail, had enrolled him in school as Marcus Henderson. For 18 years, they'd lived relatively normal lives. David worked as an accountant, Margaret taught elementary school. Marcus grew up, went to college, got a job. They'd moved around periodically, always careful, always watching for any sign that someone was asking questions. They'd avoided social media, kept Marcus off the internet as much as possible, been hyper-vigilant about not letting anyone get too close. And then they'd made the mistake of moving to Willow Creek, to a house 3 doors down from the mother whose child they'd stolen. They'd had no idea who I was. Pennsylvania is a big state. Willow Creek was just another small town, and Margaret had barely looked at me that day in the cafeteria 22 years earlier. They'd thought they were safe. Margaret's mental state during the trial was a subject of much debate. Her lawyers argued she'd been experiencing a psychotic break from grief when she'd taken Daniel, that she'd truly believed she was saving him from an unfit mother, that she'd constructed an elaborate delusional system to justify her actions. The prosecution argued she'd known exactly what she was doing, that her careful planning proved premeditation, that her continued efforts to hide the truth for over 2 decades proved ongoing criminal intent. I attended the trial. I sat in that courtroom every day for 3 weeks, watching as evidence was presented, as witnesses testified, as psychiatric experts debated Margaret's state of mind. I watched her sit at the defense table, looking smaller and older than I remembered, her gray hair now showing white roots, her hands shaking as she listened to testimony. Sometimes she looked at me, and I could see in her eyes something complex. Guilt, yes, but also defiance. A kind of fierce maternal love for the child she'd raised, even knowing he wasn't hers to raise. I couldn't hate her. That surprised me. I'd thought I'd feel pure rage, seeing the woman who'd stolen my baby, who'd stolen 25 years of his life from me. But what I felt was more complicated. She'd taken my son, had committed an inexcusable crime, had destroyed multiple lives with her actions. But she'd also clearly loved Marcus, had raised him well, had given him a stable home even if that home was built on lies. She'd done a terrible thing, but she'd done it from a place of profound maternal desperation, and as a mother myself, I could understand that desperation even if I could never excuse the actions it led to. The jury deliberated for 2 days. In the end, they found Margaret Henderson guilty on all counts: kidnapping, conspiracy, identity fraud, child endangerment, obstruction of justice. David was found guilty of conspiracy and identity fraud, though the kidnapping charge against him was dropped in accordance with his cooperation agreement. Margaret was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. David was sentenced to 10 years. I felt no satisfaction when the sentences were read. Marcus, because he'd decided to keep the name, said he'd lived with it for too long to change now, sat beside me in the courtroom, and I felt him stiffen when his mother was led away in handcuffs. He'd testified at the trial, had told the court about his childhood and the gaps in his memory, and the way he'd always felt something was wrong, but had trusted his parents too much to question deeply. But he'd also talked about how Margaret had been there for every school event, every scraped knee, every bad day. How she'd helped him with homework and taught him to cook and supported his dreams. How she'd been a good mother, even if she'd become his mother through criminal means. "I don't know how to feel," he said to me after the sentencing, as we sat in my hotel room in Philadelphia where the trial had been held. "I know what she did was wrong. I know she stole me from you. But she's still my mom, you know? She raised me. She loved me. How do I reconcile that?" "I don't think you have to," I said honestly. "I think you can acknowledge that what she did was terrible and still love the woman who raised you. Those two things can both be true." He looked at me with something like gratitude. "You're being really understanding about this." "I've had time to think about it," I told him. 25 years of thinking, really, and here's what I've come to understand. If I spend my energy hating Margaret Henderson, if I let bitterness consume me, I'll miss the chance to get to know you now. I can't get back the years she stole, but I can choose to be present for whatever years we have left. That matters more to me than revenge. It was true. In the months since discovering Marcus's identity, in the weeks since beginning to build a relationship with him, I'd found something I hadn't expected: peace. Not because everything was resolved or perfect. It wasn't, and it wouldn't be for a long time, but because the not knowing was over. The wondering and hoping and desperate late-night prayers that my son was alive somewhere, all of that was answered. He was alive. He was healthy. He was a good person despite the circumstances of his childhood. And now, slowly, carefully, we were building something that might one day look like a parent-child relationship. After the trial, Marcus made the decision to move back to Pennsylvania. He quit his job in Pittsburgh, packed up his Burlington apartment, and found a place in Willow Creek about 2 miles from my house. Not next door. We both agreed we needed some space. Some independence, but close enough that we could see each other regularly as we continued therapy and worked on building our relationship. The media attention eventually faded, as it always does. There were a few follow-up articles on the anniversary of the sentencing, a couple of podcast episodes about the case, but the news cycle moved on to other stories, other tragedies, other miracles. We were left to navigate this new reality in relative privacy, which was all we'd wanted. Building a relationship with Marcus was nothing like I'd imagined. I'd spent 25 years fantasizing about what it would be like if Daniel came home, imagining emotional reunions and instant connections and the immediate restoration of our mother-son bond. The reality was much more mundane and much more complicated. We met for coffee once a week at first, awkward conversations over lattes as we tried to figure out what to talk about. We had no shared memories, no history to reference, no inside jokes or family traditions. We were two people who shared DNA, trying to figure out if we could also share a life. Dr. Kim, who continued to serve as our family therapist, helped us navigate the difficulties. She taught us to be patient with each other, to not force connection, to let the relationship develop organically. She helped Marcus work through his complicated grief over losing the parents he'd known, helped him understand that it was okay to mourn Margaret and David even though they'd committed terrible crimes. She helped me understand that I couldn't expect Marcus to suddenly see me as his mother just because biology said I was, that I needed to earn that role through consistency and care and respect for his autonomy. Slowly, incrementally, we found our way. We discovered shared interests, a love of mystery novels, an appreciation for hiking, a tendency toward the same kind of self-deprecating humor. We learned each other's patterns and preferences. I learned that Marcus was a morning person who did his best thinking over his first cup of coffee, that he was meticulous about punctuality, that he had a tendency to downplay his own emotions until they overwhelmed him. He learned that I was stubborn and independent, that I had strong opinions about proper grammar, that I cried easily when I was happy, but rarely when I was sad. We had setbacks. There were days when Marcus couldn't handle being around me because seeing me reminded him too much of everything he'd lost. There were days when I struggled with resentment, that I'd missed his childhood, that another woman had gotten to see his first steps and hear his first words and be there for all the moments I'd dreamed about. We fought sometimes, usually about small things that were really about bigger things neither of us knew how to articulate. But we kept showing up, kept trying, kept choosing to build this relationship even when it was hard. About 6 months after the trial ended, Marcus asked if he could start calling me Mom. We were having dinner at my house. I'd learned to cook his favorite meals, had slowly been filling the gaps in my kitchen with the foods he liked, when he said it. I was thinking, he said carefully, not looking at me, about what I call you. Dorothy feels too formal, but Mom feels like it belongs to Margaret, even though I know she's not. I mean, biologically you're. Hey, I interrupted gently. Take your time. Say what you need to say. He took a breath. I want to call you Mom. I want to try it at least, because you've earned it. Not because of biology, but because of who you've been to me these past months. Patient and kind and present. That's what makes someone a mother. And I think I'm ready to acknowledge that I have two mothers. One who raised me and one who gave birth to me and loves me now. Is that okay? I couldn't speak for a moment. I just reached across the table and took his hand and nodded and let the tears come. Okay, Mom, he said with a small smile. Don't cry. Too late, I managed to say, laughing through the tears. It wasn't perfect. It was complicated and messy, and we were still figuring things out. But it was real, and it was ours, and it was something no one could take from us. 2 years have passed since that DNA test confirmed what my heart had already known. 2 years of therapy and coffee dates and slow, careful relationship building. 2 years of learning who Marcus is now and sharing with him stories of who Daniel was in those first 6 months, creating a bridge between his past and present. 2 years of healing for both of us, from trauma that took different forms but left similar scars. The community reaction in Willow Creek was overwhelmingly supportive. When Marcus moved to town, neighbors who remembered Daniel's kidnapping, who'd been part of the search parties, who'd brought casseroles to my house in those dark days after, welcomed him with open arms. The local paper did a follow-up story about his integration into the community, about how the town that had mourned his loss now celebrated his return. It was touching, though Marcus sometimes found the attention overwhelming. He was a private person by nature, and having his personal tragedy be public knowledge took adjustment. My relationship with my siblings and their families changed too. They'd grieved with me when Daniel was taken, had supported me through the worst years, but time had softened their hope. They gently suggested I move on, find ways to accept that Daniel was probably gone forever. When he came back, when Marcus came into our lives, they welcomed him but also had to grapple with their own complicated feelings. Relief that he was alive, anger that we'd all missed his childhood, awkwardness about how to integrate him into family events where he had no shared memories or history. We worked through it, like families do, with patience and forgiveness, and a lot of explaining to younger cousins who hadn't been born when Daniel was taken. Marcus struggled with his own family identity. He'd lost the parents he'd known to prison, learned that his entire childhood was a carefully constructed lie, and was now trying to build connections with biological family he'd never known existed. He went to therapy regularly, worked through layers of trauma and loss and identity confusion. Some days were better than others. Some days, he woke up angry at everyone, at Margaret for stealing him, at me for not finding him sooner, at himself for not questioning his past more thoroughly. Other days, he was able to hold the complexity, to acknowledge that multiple truths could exist simultaneously, that he'd been stolen and loved, that he'd lost one family and gained another, that his childhood had been both happy and built on crime. The legal aftermath continued to ripple outward. There were civil cases, insurance claims, questions about reparations and compensation. The hospital where Daniel had been taken paid a settlement, acknowledging their role in inadequate security. The state of Pennsylvania compensated me for their failure to solve the case. I put most of that money into a trust for Marcus, feeling it was more his than mine. He was the one who'd lived with the consequences of being stolen, who'd lost his entire identity. He tried to refuse it, said I'd suffered too, but I insisted. He eventually accepted and used some of it to go back to school, pursuing a master's degree in social work. He wanted to work with adopted children and families, to help kids who struggled with identity questions, to turn his trauma into something useful. The question of Margaret and David Henderson haunted us both. Marcus visited Margaret in prison a few times during that first year, seeking closure or answers or something he couldn't quite name. She was remorseful, he said, but also defensive. She maintained that she'd given him a good life, that she'd loved him, that she'd never meant to hurt anyone. She acknowledged the crime, but seemed unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what she'd done, the lives she'd disrupted, the pain she'd caused. Marcus stopped visiting after a few months, said it wasn't helping him heal, but he sent her cards on holidays. He couldn't stop caring about her, even knowing what she'd done. I wrote to Margaret once, just once, about a year after the trial. I needed to say things I hadn't been able to say in court, needed to tell her about the 25 years she'd stolen, about the grief she'd caused, about the life Robert and I could have had with our son. But I also needed to thank her, as strange as that sounds, for keeping Daniel safe, for raising him to be kind and thoughtful, for loving him even if she had no right to him. It was a long letter, pages and pages of everything I'd been holding inside. She never wrote back, but I heard through Marcus that she'd read it and cried and kept it in her cell. I didn't need a response. Writing it had been enough. My own healing came in unexpected ways. I started volunteering with a missing children's organization, using my story to help other families who were living the nightmare I'd lived for 25 years. I spoke at conferences, participated in awareness campaigns, helped lobby for better hospital security procedures and faster response protocols for child abductions. Turning my pain into advocacy gave it purpose, made those 25 years of grief feel less pointless. If my story could help prevent even one other family from experiencing what we'd experienced, then something good would have come from something terrible. Marcus and I settled into a routine. We had dinner together twice a week, his choice of which nights. We texted regularly, sharing articles we found interesting or photos of things we encountered that made us think of each other. We celebrated birthdays, both of them, January 8th and the date in September, when Margaret had claimed was his birthday, because both dates were part of his history. We spent holidays together, sometimes just the two of us, sometimes with my siblings and their families, creating new traditions while acknowledging all the ones we'd missed. He met a woman named Sarah through his graduate program. She was kind and patient and didn't run when he explained his complicated history. They dated for a year before he brought her to meet me, nervous that I'd judge her or that she'd judge our unusual relationship. I liked her immediately. She was good for him, grounded and supportive, and she treated our story with respect instead of sensationalism. They got engaged last fall, and Marcus asked me to help plan the wedding. "I want you involved," he said. "You're my mother. That means something." The wedding is in 3 months. I'm helping Sarah with dress shopping and venue selection and all the things mothers do. Margaret sent a letter from prison saying she understood if she wasn't invited, but asking Marcus to send her photos. He hasn't decided yet what he'll do. I told him it's his decision, that I won't be hurt either way, that he needs to do what feels right for him. That's been my approach throughout, giving him space to navigate his own relationship with his past, supporting him without trying to erase Margaret, acknowledging that love isn't zero-sum and he's allowed to care about the woman who raised him even while building a relationship with me. Looking back now at the woman I was 3 years ago, the lonely widow in the small house on Maple Street, going through the motions of life without real purpose, I barely recognize her. Finding Daniel didn't erase the 25 years of pain. It didn't magically restore what was stolen or make everything okay. But it gave me hope, gave me purpose, gave me my son back in a way I'd stopped believing was possible. I'm 70 now. Marcus is 28. We can't get back the time we lost, can't undo the trauma and grief and years of separation. But we have now, and we have the future, and we've learned to make that enough. The house 3 doors down, the one the Hendersons lived in, has new owners now. A young family with 2 little kids. I watch them sometimes, playing in the yard, the parents watchful and loving. It doesn't hurt anymore, seeing what I missed. It just reminds me to appreciate what I have. A son who calls me mom, who includes me in his life, who's building a future I get to be part of. A second chance I never thought I'd get. I'm telling you this story today because I need you to understand something important. It's never too late. It's never too late for truth to surface, never too late for justice, never too late to get back what was taken from you. For 25 years, I lived in a world where my son was gone, probably dead, certainly lost to me forever. I'd accepted that reality, or at least learned to live within it. I'd stopped hoping, stopped believing that I'd ever have answers. And then a family moved in 3 doors down, and my maternal instinct, that deep, inexplicable knowing that goes beyond logic, started whispering that something wasn't right. I could have ignored it. I probably should have ignored it by any rational standard. The chances that my long-lost son would end up living on my street were astronomical. The idea that I'd recognize him after 25 years seemed like desperate wishful thinking. But I didn't ignore it. I paid attention to the small signs, the accumulating coincidences, the feeling in my gut that something significant was happening. And because I trusted that instinct, because I was willing to look crazy and ask questions and pursue a truth that seemed impossible, I got my son back. Here's what I want you to take from my story. Trust yourself. If something feels wrong, investigate it. If your instincts are screaming at you, listen. Don't let fear of being wrong, fear of being laughed at, fear of hoping for something impossible stop you from pursuing truth. Yes, sometimes our instincts are wrong. Sometimes coincidences are just coincidences. But sometimes they're not. And if you don't follow them, you'll never know. I also want you to understand that recovery isn't simple or clean or immediate. Marcus and I found each other, but we didn't instantly become mother and son in any meaningful way. We've had to build that, piece by piece, over years. We've had to navigate trauma and grief and complicated feelings about the woman who raised him and the father he'll never meet. We've had to learn each other as the people we are now, not the mother and infant we were 25 years ago. It's been hard work. Sometimes painful work, but it's been worth every difficult conversation and every setback. If you're watching this and you've lost someone, if you're living with unresolved grief, if you've given up hope of ever finding answers, I see you. I was you for 25 years. I understand the weight of not knowing, the exhaustion of hoping, the temptation to just accept loss and move on. And I'm not going to tell you that everyone gets the ending I got, because that wouldn't be true. Not every lost child comes home. Not every mystery gets solved. Not every grieving parent gets closure. But some do. And you don't know which category you fall into until you stop accepting what you've been told and start asking your own questions. Until you trust that maybe, just maybe, the universe hasn't finished writing your story yet. To the mothers out there, the fathers, the siblings and children and spouses living with loss, don't stop looking. Don't stop hoping. Don't let anyone convince you that it's been too long, that you need to move on, that you're being irrational by refusing to accept what seems like inevitable truth. Sometimes irrational hope is the most rational thing we can hold on to. Sometimes refusing to accept loss is the only thing that keeps us moving forward. And sometimes, just sometimes, that stubborn refusal to give up leads us exactly where we need to be. I was 66 years old when I started suspecting that Marcus was Daniel. 67 when it was confirmed. If you'd told me at 65 that within 2 years I'd have my son back, I would have thought you were cruel to give me false hope. I'd spent so long in grief, so long in acceptance of loss, that hope felt dangerous. It felt like setting myself up for deeper pain. But hope, it turns out, wasn't cruel. Hope was the thread that led me home to my son, or him home to me, or us home to each other. Hope was what made me pay attention instead of looking away, what made me ask questions instead of accepting easy answers, what made me trust my instincts instead of dismissing them as wishful thinking. And if hope can do that for a 67-year-old widow who'd given up on ever seeing her son again, imagine what it might do for you. Before I finish this story, I want to share something with you. This channel, these stories about women like me who find strength later in life, who refuse to accept defeat, who fight for truth and justice and family, this channel matters. It matters because it shows that life doesn't end at 50 or 60 or 70. It matters because it proves that age doesn't diminish our capacity for courage, for change, for claiming what's ours. If you're sitting there right now, if you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you've felt something in hearing how I got my son back, then I need you to do something for me. I need you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. I need you to hit that like button if this story touched you. I need you to comment below. Tell me what city or country you're watching from. Share your own story if you feel comfortable doing so. Let me know what you think about what happened. Here's why. Every subscription, every like, every comment tells YouTube that these stories matter, that people want to hear about women like us, that there's an audience for stories about late life empowerment and second chances and refusing to be defeated by circumstances. And the more people who subscribe and engage, the more the algorithm shares these stories, the more people get to hear them. I'm building this channel from scratch, one story at a time, trying to reach women and families who need to hear that it's not over, that you can still fight, that you can still win. Your support makes that possible. Your 3 seconds to subscribe and like and comment, that's literally the difference between this story reaching hundreds of people or thousands of people. That's the difference between someone out there who needs to hear this message getting to hear it or not. So please, if this story meant something to you, if Dorothy's journey gave you hope or made you think, or reminded you to trust your instincts. Take those 3 seconds. Subscribe, like, comment what city you're in. Tell me what you think. And in doing so, you're not just supporting this channel. You're helping spread a message that needs to be spread, that age doesn't diminish us, that it's never too late, that mother's instincts matter. That truth eventually surfaces if we're brave enough to look for it. Your support helps me dedicate more time to this channel, to creating more stories, to reaching more people who need these messages. We're building a community here, people who believe in second chances and justice and the power of refusing to give up. Be part of that. Join us. Help us grow. Marcus is coming over for dinner tonight. We're making lasagna together. He's getting better at cooking, and we've made it a tradition to try new recipes together on Sunday evenings. Sarah might join us. She often does now that she and Marcus are engaged. We'll eat and talk and probably watch some terrible reality TV show that we all pretend we don't love. And it will be normal and comfortable and exactly the kind of ordinary evening I spent 25 years believing I'd never have with my son. I look at him sometimes, really look at him, and I can still see the baby he was. The auburn hair is the same, just longer and styled differently. The eyes are the same gray-green that I used to stare into while he nursed. The way he laughs, throwing his head back slightly, that's mine too. I gave him that laugh. And even though he doesn't remember being Daniel, doesn't remember those first 6 months we had together, I remember enough for both of us. Do I wish things had been different? Do I wish he'd never been taken, that I'd gotten to raise him, that Robert had lived to see him come home? Of course I do. Every single day. I'll never stop grieving the 25 years we lost, the childhood I didn't get to witness, the life we could have had. That grief is permanent now, woven into who I am. But I also wouldn't trade what we have now for anything. We built this relationship from nothing. 2 strangers who shared DNA learning to become family. And maybe that's more valuable in some ways than if it had just been handed to us. We chose each other, day after day, even when it was hard, even when it would have been easier to walk away. We chose to show up, to be patient, to trust that eventually the distance would close and we'd find our way to something that looked like mother and son. If you're out there living with loss, living with unanswered questions, living with the exhaustion of hoping for something that seems impossible, this is what I want you to know. You're stronger than you think you are. You can survive longer than you believe possible. And sometimes, just sometimes, survival turns into something more. Sometimes the story you thought was over is just pausing, gathering breath for the next chapter. It took me 25 years to find my son. 25 years of not knowing, of searching for answers that never came, of learning to live with a loss that felt unsurvivable. But I survived it. And then, when I'd finally accepted that Daniel was gone forever, when I'd resigned myself to a life without answers, he walked back into my world 3 doors down on Maple Street. Your story might not end the way mine did. I'm not going to pretend that everyone gets this kind of miracle, that all lost children come home, that all mysteries solve themselves. Life doesn't work that way. Sometimes loss is permanent, and we have to find ways to live with that reality. But sometimes, if you pay attention, if you trust your instincts, if you're brave enough to hope when hope seems foolish, if you're willing to ask uncomfortable questions and pursue unlikely answers, sometimes you get your miracle. Sometimes the universe isn't done with you yet. Sometimes the story you thought was over was just beginning its second act. I'm 70 years old. My son is 28. We can't get back what was stolen, can't rewind time, can't undo the damage or erase the scars. But we have now. We have dinner on Sunday nights and text conversations about nothing and the slow, steady building of a relationship that nobody can take from us. That's what I want to leave you with. It's never too late. It's never too late to hope, to search, to believe, to fight for what's yours. It's never too late to start over, to build something new, to claim the life you deserve. Age is just a number, and loss is just a chapter, and as long as you're breathing, you're allowed to keep writing your story. Thank you for listening to mine. Thank you for being here, for caring about an old woman's journey to find her son. Thank you for subscribing, for liking, for commenting, for being part of this community we're building together. These stories matter because you make them matter, because you share them and engage with them and spread the message that it's never too late for any of us. I'm Dorothy Walsh. I'm 70 years old, and 25 years after losing my baby boy, I got him back. Not the way I expected, not in the time frame I'd hoped for, not without pain and complications and 1,000 difficult moments. But I got him back, and that's what matters. If I can do it at 67, you can do whatever it is you're trying to do at whatever age you are. Don't let anyone tell you it's too late. Don't let anyone convince you to stop hoping, stop trying, stop fighting for what's yours. It's never too late. Not for me, not for Marcus, and not for you. Thank you for being here. Until next time, take care of yourselves, trust your instincts, and never stop believing that your story isn't over yet.